How we doing, boys and girls?
She's like, next time you come back, I'll hook you up. And I came in, and she gave me what felt like your half of tools. Those things are heavy too.
The piece flew the shape.
Curled a little bit?
Yes, so when I file it, my edges were completely off. But I just put it like this.
And we don't really see her in like 8-9 years, and then I get a and then she found out that jewelry nuts.
I'm going to put this
It's interesting.
here. I'm going to cover it for a second.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
Really arcing and lighting.
You can put it.
Really nice people.
It would be nice if Santa Claus it were like a mat cutter, so it would matter when you run it, it's always the right angle. We should invent that and make some other
A vice that does 45.
Right. But it wouldn't be a little bit.
It's right on 250, and if you go over 31F, do you know Fairport at all? No, aren't you smart? You're seeing how well it is.
Okay, I wonder if I can call your attention up here. All kinds of options here. And the point being, in any of the work we do, the question to ask is, what do I need? Not what do they sell, not what's out there, not just what is my... You are working in an environment all the time. If that environment is filled with shiny commercial tools, there is, to my way of thinking, there is a certain energy around that. A little silver dot that's actually stuck on there, which is not what you want. So to get rid of that, I'm just going to take a clean, dry brush and just dust it off. In the United States, of course, we have a tradition like any culture that goes back to the folk arts. And really, these were the trades. There were metalworkers, blacksmiths, jewelry makers, Paul Revere, and so on. But relevant to contemporary society, there's an argument to be made that the American crafts movement started right after World War II. And the GI Bill was one of the big contributors to that. And the fact that we had a whole generation of people who literally got pulled off the family farm, pulled out of the family garage, and so on, and discovered that they didn't have to follow in their father's business. And all of a sudden they had an opportunity for an education that wouldn't have existed before. This was the beginning of many of the American craft university programs, or the art programs for that matter. If we look at the large schools, colleges, and universities, and track back to the beginning of an art department that was not limited to the classical fine arts, that somehow reached beyond painting and sculpture and printmaking to include things like sculpture, ceramics, textiles. 9 times out of 10, you'll find that these schools developed these programs in the 50s and the early 60s. Of course, this was congruent with the hippie movement, the Back to the Earth movement. So it was a broad cultural mix of forces that gave rise to this. I've been involved in the crafts intimately for most of my life, and so I take for granted their depth and breadth through the culture. But it surprises people when they find out that there is such a thing as advanced degrees in jewelry making, for instance, and in ceramics, and in printmaking, and in textiles. And in fact, they're not rare. I think it's safe to say that every single state in the Union has a college or university that offers advanced degrees, and in many cases multiple degrees, and many versions of baccalaureate degrees. So there's a huge breadth to the American contemporary craft movement. Over the last decade to maybe 2 decades, there has been a tremendous explosion within this field, and that I would attribute to, again, a number of forces. One of them being the internet and access of information, and always economics. The economy ties in. In the 50s and 60s, there was the hippies at the younger generation. Their parents were getting involved in what was called do-it-yourself at the time. This was when people were painting by number, they were doing macrame, they were building craft rooms, they were learning flower arrangement, and so on. This was almost always a hobby situation. This was something to fill time, to meet friends, to go out. It was primarily a social activity for probably the majority of people who were doing this. And probably the majority, I was going to say, were women. An exception to that would be woodworking. There's tremendous growth of woodworking. Doctors, lawyers, Indian chiefs, men of all different stripes were working in their basements, developing pretty sophisticated work. There were summer programs, as there still are, where people could go to improve their skills and meet like-minded people. There are a huge number of magazines to address this. And if you look at some of the leading magazines, Fine Woodworking, Fine Home Building, Metalsmith Magazine, you'll find that many of these got started in the period we're talking about, the late 50s, early 60s. I was saying, however, in the more recent time, in the last, say, 10 or 15 years, there is, while I think that still exists, I think there is still a large number of people who work with their hands in the crafts as a hobby. And by hobby, I mean something that its primary goal is self-fulfillment. Yeah, they do it for fun. There is another large and increasingly getting larger group that fills the space between hobby on the one end and professional on the other end. There is this middle zone, and this is somebody who says, no, I do it for fun, but I make money. I'm not a professional, I've got a day job, or I'm supported by a partner, but at the same time I take this very seriously. It's not just a lark for me. I study, I work hard at it, and I invest money in it, I invest money in myself, and I expect to make a secondary income off of this, sometimes significant, sometimes less so, but definitely a second income. And this is something that I find more true of the United States than other cultures I've looked into, that we have this middle zone. I've traveled some in Japan, and Japan seems to be more like where we were in the 60s. There wasn't a venue for sales, and this is really what makes the difference. We have people who want to work at a higher level, and we have an infrastructure that will support that. On the one hand, we have magazines, books, classes, workshops. There's a huge. I mean, any given weekend in the United States, there are some thousands of classes being offered for the advanced hobbyists. So we have all of that infrastructure, and on the other end, we have a place for people to sell and to make money. So that they're in jewelry, for instance, there are craft galleries, there are craft co-ops, but I find people selling jewelry at hairdressing salons, for instance. There are little shows at coffee shops. You can't go into a coffee shop and not see photographs or prints or paintings on the wall. And people understand this is available for sale and value that. People value a Christmas present that was made by hand, and not by the giver, by somebody that the giver knew, somebody in their community. Precious metal clay is a fascinating phenomenon. I've been lucky enough to be involved in that really since it came to the United States first, which is in the mid to late 90s, I guess 95, 96 was when it was first brought to the United States. And it is a totally new thing. The clay itself, the material itself, is a clay-like version of pure metals, fine silver or fine gold. It's worked with clay techniques, which is to say you can use your fingers, you can just pinch it, squeeze it, mold it. It's extremely accessible material to work with. And yet, unlike most accessible materials, it's a valuable material. I mean, other accessible things are hot glue and dried flowers and so on. Those are great, but they don't have the intrinsic value of silver and gold, of course. Well, it's been fascinating to see this. And be able to encapsulate what's happened, because it's happened in really just a dozen or so years so far. It's not distant history. When we look at traditional jewelry making techniques, of course, who knows, how soldering got started, or who the first person was to develop a signet ring and so on. It's long since gone, but this history is actually happening right around us. So it's fascinating just at that level, just from a sociological level, to be able to say, oh, here these people sat around this table on this day and made this decision or decided not to go in that direction. Well, that's been kind of fun. It's also been fascinating to watch a community develop, really a community built out of thin air. I'm sure this happens all the time, but this is the first one that I have seen. And you become aware, having a certain kind of long view over it, that it doesn't have to be this way. For instance, the PMC community is characterized, in my opinion, by open-mindedness, open-heartedness. It's very generous, sharing, collaborative, supportive community. It'd be interesting to ferret out exactly why that's so. One immediate thought is the nature of the people who come to it. There's a novelty factor just in the material. It's just cool stuff and everybody's kind of buzzed about using it. But beyond that, there seems to be an earnest desire to shape a positive community. If somebody comes along and doesn't get it, if they're kind of secretive or negative, the rest of the community kind of won't let that fly. They just not exactly turn on them, but there's just no traction for that person. And the result is that there has developed a community, and I would say in the United States, as I sit here, there are between 40,000 and 50,000 people working with precious metal clay at some level. Some would use it once a month, and others use it 10 times a day. But it's a healthy sized community of people. They tend to know who the leaders are. There seems to be consensus about all the big points, how it works and what to do with it and so on. It is probably not a fluke that this happened at a time in history consistent with that middle market that we were talking about. The fact is that there is this availability for people to make a secondary income making jewelry. So we have people, in other words, PMC plays into a kind of person, a person who says, I take this seriously, I do it for fun, but I also want to end up with a product that I'm proud of, that has value in the marketplace, that other people will actually want to pay money for and want to wear. This material just arrived at the right moment in time, I think. In the PMC community, we're blessed by having a confluence of participants from a wide range of backgrounds. It's a terrific add-on material, if you will. Somebody who has been working, for instance, in polymer clay, has developed a style, has developed certain motor skills, has a skill with polymer clay, they can move into precious metal clay, and all of that's transferable. Their manual dexterity, their tools, their aesthetics, just without skipping a beat, they can pick that up. Same thing is true with ceramics. Somebody who's been working in ceramics has an ability to think three-dimensionally, to think constructively, to imagine how a piece gets assembled, and bingo, carries right over to the metal clay world, and so on and so on. So there's this wonderful enriching coming together. People from these various communities each bring their unique qualities, and it makes the stew that much richer. And I think that's not a private observation on my part. I think everybody gets it. We just see that, and it's a wonderful kind of a metaphor. I would love to see our national politic adopt the same concept, that in fact it's everybody's uniqueness that makes the whole situation that much more ripe and full and fulfilling. And that seems to be the case so far anyway with metal clay. One piece of this perhaps is an internet. Again, the information just flows in a way. There was the internet, but then there was Google, which really changed things. So the fact is, all it takes is a whisper in your ear, and you think, oh, what was that? And you can search for it, and before you know it, you're just zoomed into the heart of the information. In this case, you're tied into the community. There are chat rooms, there are examples, there are techniques, project sheets. There are just thousands, tens of thousands of pages of information about metal clay on the internet. So it means that a hurdle that would have existed in an earlier age, when copper forming was first kind of popularized, when silversmithing was first popularized, and those would have been in the 20s and 40s respectively. You had to know somebody. Basically, you wouldn't stumble into it. It was a difficult thing to have access to. Even in books, there were 5 books maybe on coppersmithing in the say the 1940s, and now it literally has been an explosion of knowledge and access to that knowledge. And I think again, this is just a coming together of a new material, a new attitude, if you will, and access to information that just didn't exist before. So we're sitting at a perfect spot. Elsewhere on this DVD, you'll see the work of Alicia Fink, who is a perfect example of the kind of things I'm talking about. Just from a data kind of point of view, she is absolutely typical of the people who have gone into PMC. We find it is overwhelmingly women who pick this up for reasons I don't necessarily understand, but and tend to be women who are in the middle section of their life, I would say, often coming from something else, sometimes similar. They've been a jeweler, a potter, an artist, but just as often they're coming from something that would seem to be quite distant, nursing, for instance, or healthcare, or administration, or some other field, and very frequently have entered as in answer to a personal need and minor curiosity. I mean, when you ask people, how'd you get into this? Usually they say, it was fun. I was with a buddy. They said, let's take this class. Somebody told me about it. I read a magazine article. It was usually just sort of a casual thing. Very rarely do we hear somebody who had a master plan, who said, I decided this was where I was going to go. It's much more typical that it's one foot in front of another. I make a piece. That was fun. I'll make 2 more. That was still fun. I'll make 4 more, and 2 of them sold. And before you know it, a person develops greater skill. Alicia's work is terrific, I think, in its ability to connect with her life. I love the way she makes reference to her childhood and images from her native country. That's great, and it could be done in many different ways. It's not unique to PMC, but a material that is so pliable and so quick to pick up form and texture is just a natural. It really has, it allows almost a childlike spontaneity. And that is true not only in the working, but I think in the wearing also. I think her pieces have a real zest and a freshness that we see it from around the world, and I'm not sure what the politically correct term is. We used to call it a primitive aspect. And I would only say that in the most positive sense. There is a freshness and a vitality to African masks and textiles that I've seen from the Polynesian islands and so on, that it speaks of the maker. You look at these pieces and you see the hand at work. You see the gesture of the hand at work. You see the smile on the face of the person who's making this. And who wouldn't want to buy into that? Who wouldn't want to have a piece of that kind of vitality and history in their own collection, and possibly to be able to hang on their body? So I think Alicia does a terrific job at capturing that. And I think, well, there's a term in arts, they talk about the naive artist or the untrained artist. And usually that's in the context, in a positive context. It means somebody who has not been overly programmed by formal academic training. An outsider artist, someone who works directly from the heart. And I think Alicia's work is a good example of that, and I don't think she's alone in the PMC community. I think, though I'm not saying other people's work looks like hers, there are other people with different backgrounds, with different strengths, with different aesthetics, who manage to sustain that kind of energetic, childlike quality. And that's interesting to me, that, as I've been saying, that PMC is accessible from a technical point of view. It doesn't take many tools. You don't need a specific workshop. You can do it at a kitchen table with simple tools. So it's accessible in that regard. But the finished product is also accessible. I think if you were to just compare a pair of earrings bought at a jewelry store in the mall, they'd be shiny and gold, and the edges would be crisp and straight, and you would look at it and kind of wag your head if you bothered to think about it at all and think, I don't know how that was made. I have no idea who made this? Was it one person? Was it 12 people? Were there big machines involved? Don't know anything about it. However, when you look at a piece of Alicia's jewelry or much other PMC jewelry, you get a sense, like a finger painting of a child. You get a sense, oh, there's a hand at work there. Somebody made this. And it's accessible because if somebody made it, maybe I could make it. And whether you do or not is almost not the point. Whether that wearer, in fact, decides to take a PMC class or buy some and see if they can make it, which some do, but that's not even the point I'm making. It's more that they could. There is that sense of, wow, this is a human scale activity. I'm a human and a human made this. And so there's a point of connection, subtle, intuitive, but it's there.